Hello everyone and welcome back to class. This is Applied Anatomy and Physiology, AAP 301 for the College of Natural Health Sciences, Bermuda. My name is Dr. Delcina Bean Burrows and this is lecture number 22, where in today's lecture we will be looking at the spinal nerves. And in terms of our lecture 22 objectives, at the end of today's lecture, students will understand what spinal nerves are and how they function, be familiar with the plexuses of the nervous system, understand the impact of spinal nerve injury, be able to describe spinal nerve conditions such as sciatica and shingles, and be familiar with dermatome maps and their usefulness in clinical practice. Okay, so we begin today's lecture by exploring the spinal nerves. At about 45 centimeters long, the human spinal cord is an information superhighway that connects the brain to the rest of the body. That may seem tiny compared to even the shortest interstate, but the best thing about the spinal cord is that electrical signals don't get stuck in traffic. In a fraction of a second, pathways of sensory neurons can transmit information from the tip of your toe all the way to your brain. Like most big highways, the spinal cord also has exits that lead to smaller local pathways. These exits, the spinal nerves, are what we're going to be focusing on here today. Where are they? What do they connect to? What happens when one of them gets closed down? So we're going to take a look at the spine. The first step on our exploration of the spine is understanding its components. The spinal cord is encased in connective tissue and supported by the vertebrae, and it is made up of neural tissue, the gray and white matter. The vertebral column, which surrounds the spinal cord, is actually longer than the spinal cord, measuring around 71 centimeters for men and 61 centimeters for women. In the average adult human, this column contains 33 vertebrae in 5 different sections: 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae, 5 sacral vertebrae, which are fused to form the sacrum, and 4 coccygeal vertebrae, which are fused to form the tailbone. There are also 23 discs made of gel-like fluid surrounded by cartilage between the vertebrae. They allow for flexibility and shock absorption. So, what is a nerve? Well, a nerve is a group of axons of many neurons, all protected by connective tissue, which is an axon is the long tail of a neuron. Outside the brain, axons can get pretty long. The longest neuron in the body extends from the base of the spine to the big toe, a distance that can measure up to a meter. Spinal nerves are referred to as mixed nerves because they contain both sensory and motor axons. Sensory neurons and pathways report information about the outside world back to the brain, whereas motor neurons and pathways relay orders from the brain back to the body, back out to the body. This means that spinal nerves are a vital link between the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is the neurons everywhere else. So let's take a look at spinal nerve pairs. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves branching off from the spinal cord, named for the parts of the spine where they attach. The spinal nerves on each side of the body are as follows. There are 8 cervical spinal nerves, C01 to C08, but we normally just say C1 to C8, 12 thoracic spinal nerves, T1 to T12, 5 lumbar spinal nerves, L1 to L5, 5 sacral spinal nerves, S1 to S5, and 1 coccygeal spinal nerve, which is the coccygeal nerve. As you can see in the image illustrated here, these nerves peek out from the spaces between the vertebrae, which are known as neuroforamina, also foramen. So usually a spinal nerve will travel through the foramen above the vertebra that it shares its number. So for example, spinal nerve C4 travels through the foramen between vertebrae C3 and C4. Now, as is par for the course in the nervous system, spinal nerves branch almost immediately once they exit the foramina. These early branches are called rami. The singular word is ramus. Posterior rami go on to innervate the skin and muscles of the back, and the anterior rami innervate areas such as the trunk and the limbs. The anterior rami do this by forming a plexus, which is clusters of nerves that then split into named nerves that innervate more remote areas of the body. Typically, the anterior rami that forms plexuses are those of the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral spinal nerves. The anterior rami of spinal nerves, which is T1 through T11, and S5 and the coccygeal nerve, on the other hand, do not form plexuses. Instead, T1 through to T11's anterior rami form the intercostal nerves, which wrap around to the front of the body to innervate the intercostal muscles between the ribs as well as a few abdominal muscles. Let's take a look at the head and shoulders, the cervical plexus. The right and left cervical plexuses are made up of anterior rami from the cervical spinal nerve C1 through to C4, and they innervate anterior neck muscles as well as skin on the neck, head, and shoulders. Parts of C5 also contribute to the cervical plexus, but C5 isn't generally considered to be part of the plexus. The phrenic nerve, made up of axons from C3 through to C5, is also not technically a part of the cervical plexus. However, it is important to note because it innervates the diaphragm. If you are breathing, which I hope you are, you can thank the phrenic nerve. In the image here, you can see how C3 and C5 connect to the phrenic nerve and how the phrenic nerve extends downwards to the diaphragm. Now let's consider the power cords, the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus, composed of the anterior rami of the spinal nerve C5 through T1, innervate the arms and pectoral girdle. You can use the Latin word for arm, brachium, to remember this. The brachial plexus is a bit more complex than the cervical plexus because its nerves divide and unify several times on the way to their destinations. First, the nerves of the brachial plexus form trunks, which each split into anterior and posterior divisions. Then portions of these divisions unify again to form these cords. In this image, you can see the spinal nerves exiting the foramina and forming the upper, middle, and lower trunks. Nerves from the anterior division of the brachial plexus generally innervate muscles that flex parts of the arm and nerves from the posterior division of the brachial plexus usually innervate muscles that extend parts of the arm. Above, or I should say here to the side, each trunk splits into two divisions and the posterior, medial, and lateral cords are formed. You can also see how the nerves dip under the clavicle as the trunks split and unify into the cords. We can also see the main terminal branches of each cord, that is, the named nerves that connect back to the spinal nerves of the brachial plexus. Portions of C5 through to T1 form the posterior cord. Its first terminal branch is the axillary nerve, which innervates muscles such as the deltoids in the upper arm. Its other terminal branch is the radial nerve, which innervates posterior arm muscles such as the triceps. Portions of C8 through T1 form the medial cord, which has two terminal branches. The first of these branches is the median nerve, which also contains portions of the lateral cord. This nerve is responsible for innervating most of the anterior muscles of the upper arm. If you've ever whacked your funny bone on something, you know what it feels like to hit your ulnar nerve, the other terminal branch of the medial cord. Lastly, portions of C5 through to C7 form the lateral cord. Its terminal branches are the median nerve discussed above and the musculocutaneous nerve, try saying that 5 times fast, which innervates more anterior arm muscles. The knees, the lumbar plexus. Now we're going to travel down to the lumbar spine and some of the spinal nerves responsible for innervating muscles in the legs and pelvis. The anterior rami of L1 through L4 form the lumbar plexus, which innervates the muscles of the thigh and skin on the inside of the leg. The nerves of this plexus also divide into anterior and posterior portions. The femoral nerve, which innervates such anterior thigh muscles as the quadriceps femoris, knee extensor, and the hip flexors, is the main branch of the anterior division. The main branch of the posterior division is the obturator nerve, which innervates the thigh adductors, which is the medial thigh muscles. Now let's take a look at the toes indirectly, the sacral plexus. The sacral plexus is composed of the anterior rami of L4 through S4, and it has anterior and posterior divisions. Nerves from the anterior division tend to innervate muscles that participate in flexion or plantar flexion in the lower limb, whereas nerves from the posterior division tend to innervate muscles that participate in extension or dorsiflexion. Together, these nerves innervate the pelvis, luteal region, perineum, and much of the leg. When the powers of the anterior and posterior portions of the sacral plexus combine, they form the sciatic nerve. This nerve is the largest and longest nerve in the body, so it does a lot of work to keep the body running right. The anterior portion of the sciatic nerve forms the tibial nerve. The posterior portion forms the common fibular nerve, which splits into the deep fibular nerve and the superficial fibular nerve. These innervate many anterior and lateral muscles of the leg, respectively. So now let's discuss what happens when there is an injury to the spinal nerves. You may be asking yourself what happens when something goes wrong with the spinal nerves. So for now, we're going to focus on two examples, one involving a pinching of a spinal nerve and the other involving a disease that impacts the spinal nerves. Radiculopathy is the condition that arises when a spinal nerve is pinched. Symptoms often include tingling, pain, loss of feeling, or muscle weakness in the regions of muscle and skin innervated by that particular nerve. Let's now consider sciatica, which is injury to the sciatic nerve, otherwise known as lumbar radiculopathy. As an example, sciatica is frequently caused by a slipped or herniated disc. What does that mean? Sometimes the outside of the disc fiber wears down and the inside of the disc, the gel portion, gets pushed to the side where it can push on the root of a spinal nerve. When a slipped disc presses too hard on the root of the sciatic nerve, this often causes pain in the buttock and thigh on one side. Surprise, surprise, these are areas innervated by the sciatic nerve. Shingles or herpes zoster is a case in which dermatomes in particular are affected. A dermatome is the region of skin supplied by a spinal nerve. Essentially, shingles happens when the chickenpox virus, varicella zoster, gets into the posterior root ganglion of one or more spinal nerves and lies dormant in the body, often for many years. When the virus becomes active again, the dermatomes of the affected spinal nerves develop a painful itchy rash. To see how shingles affects dermatomes, take a look at the map of common areas where shingles rashes often occur side by side with a dermatome map of the body. The comparison is striking. For example, the patches going around the ribs look similar to the stripe-like pattern of the dermatomes of the thoracic spinal nerves. So let's talk a little bit more about dermatome mapping. Dermatome maps depict the sensory distribution of each dermatome across the body. Clinicians can assess cutaneous sensation with a dermatome map as a way to localize lesions within central nervous tissue, injury to specific spinal nerves, and to determine the extent of the injury. Okay, so we have reached the end of today's lecture, and for assignment number 22, I'd like for you to explain what are spinal nerves, how many pairs of spinal nerves are there, what are plexuses and what are their names, what happens when spinal nerves become injured, what is sciatica and what are the symptoms, what is shingles and what are the symptoms, what is a dermatome and what is a dermatome map, and why are dermatome maps useful in clinical practice. Now, this assignment is due this coming Sunday by 11:55 p.m. If you have difficulty with this assignment, please send me an email or a text message. And remember that my office hours are on Thursdays from 4 to 6 p.m. And with that, I look forward to receiving your assignment, and I will see you in the next lecture.